me, you probably think that witch hunting is something people did in the Middle Ages. No, the crazy truth is that we literally accused and killed more witches in the past 5 decades than we ever did in the Middle Ages. Yeah, I know, insane. We'll come back to this later. Look, this whole witch hunting phenomena where dozens, hundreds, hell even inhabitants of entire cities would be accused of witchcraft and killed. This didn't happen in the Middle Ages.
Oh yeah.
What's weird and seems like a contradiction is that these great witch hunts, well, they began in the early modern period, during a time of scientific breakthroughs. This period in history is often referred to as the Renaissance. It's all the likes of Galileo, Isaac Newton, and Francis Bacon. And yet, this is when the witch craze began. In these witch hunts, men would strip women, shave their heads, and inspect their bodies for signs of the devil. They would torture them, and in the end, either burn, drown, or hang them. In less than 3 centuries, between 40 to 60,000 people would lose their lives at the hands of their neighbors, loved ones, and even children. There are a lot of articles and programs that describe the witch hunts in detail, but barely any of them answered the most important question: the why. Why the hell did all of this suddenly happen? That's what I really want to know. To answer this burning question, we need to go all the way back to the beginning, to the origins of civilization and the evolution of magic. In the ancient world, belief in magic was practically universal. The word magic itself is derived from the word magi. The magi were ancient Zoroastrian astrologer priests. These priests would perform good magic at dawn or during the day to bring back light and purity into the world. According to them, the sorceresses of the old gods, the demons, would cast their spells in the dead of night and curse the world with pain and suffering. Each culture had their own interpretation of evil magic, and laws to deal with witchcraft were present from the time of Hammurabi to today in Saudi Arabia, where executing witches is still shockingly a legal procedure. But unlike Saudi Arabia today, in the ancient world, people didn't view all practitioners of sorcery as evil. For example, necromancy, the practice of using the magical powers of summoned spirits, didn't have the same infamous connotations that it has today. You could say that there were roughly 2 categories of sorcerers throughout history: magi and necromancers, who used their powers to make divinations at court, were in category 1, practitioners of high magic. They were required to study many rare and expensive books, an opportunity that was only really available to the upper class. And then there was category 2, common magic. Common magic was performed by, say, a traveling herbalist, or the wise old woman in the village. They would use their knowledge of plants and other passed down superstitions to make potions and remedies for ailments such as warts or insomnia. The Romans didn't have a law against this sort of magic. The idea was that if you were dumb enough to pay for this sort of thing, you'd deserve whatever you get, and there was no need to clog up the courts with these trivial matters. This was the typical attitude of many empires and kingdoms that came before or after the Romans. In fact, Charlemagne, the most famous monarch from the Middle Ages, who established the Holy Roman Empire in the 9th century, proclaimed that anyone who thought that witches existed was a heretic himself for believing in this nonsense. But over the next few years, a chain of events were about to take place that would change everything. Divinations using the ritual art of spirit and demon summoning would become widespread when translations of Greek, Persian, and Arabic books of magic flooded into Europe after the Crusades. At the same time, a series of calamities would grip the lives of people, and the great sense of anxiety that they left behind would transform and evolve the perception of the devil in the popular imagination as more powerful than ever before. And finally, with the birth of the modern state and the invention of the printing press, a new system was about to be devised to root out the devil and his servants, the ones responsible for all those calamities. This new system was the fuel that stoked the fire of jealousy, spite, superstition, and misogyny that led to the witch hunts. This is a jinn, a mythical being that has existed in the popular imagination of people in Mesopotamia since the time of old Sumeria. According to folklore, they are beings formed from smokeless fire who occupy a space between the earthly and celestial realm. They are powerful and wise beings who can live for thousands of years. Yet they are mortal and require food to live. They are prone to emotions like anger and lust, and occasionally even form relationships with humans they desire. I'm sure you are already familiar with the story of the genie in the lamp, the one that would grant you 3 wishes once you released it from the lamp. Well, this is actually how magicians in the Middle East attempted to perform magic. They would perform rituals to first summon and trap the jinn in a mirror or a glass jar. Then they would strike a bargain with the jinn for its freedom if the jinn used its magical powers to aid the magician. When translations of jinn summoning rites entered Europe, the practice of invocation and command of dead spirits and demons became popular amongst court magicians. But theologians and inquisitors whose mission was rooting out heretical beliefs accused these necromancers and magicians of serving the demons they had summoned instead of actually commanding them. Paranoia and anxiety was an everyday mood in these times because a series of ongoing calamities had swept across the continent. The plague that wiped out 1/3 of the population. The Little Ice Age that wiped out entire harvests. 5 centuries of some of the coldest winters in recorded history. And finally, the Great Reformation that had split Europe in 2, creating fractions between neighbors, monarchs, and siblings alike. The Great Schism, kick-started by Martin Luther, who was an avid believer in witchcraft himself, led to many long and brutal civil wars that devastated Europe. This anxious mood shifted the attitude of the elites in society towards witchcraft, from a healthy skepticism to paralyzing paranoia. Slowly but surely, genuine belief in dark magic and the awesome powers of the devil and his servants took root in theologians, philosophers, judges, and even monarchs. Originally, the witch was a male figure. Magicians and necromancers who invoked the powers of jinns were practitioners of high magic, usually literate men from the upper classes. So you might be asking yourself, how come so many poor, old, and illiterate women started being accused and condemned instead? This was thanks to 2 things: the popular superstitions that the commoners held, and a series of incredibly misogynistic books written by demonologists. The invention of the printing press allowed these rather dark fantasies to spread like ink in the water. One of these books, published in 1487, was called Malleus Maleficarum, also known as the Hammer of Witches. This book received a seal of approval from the Pope, kings, and princes of Europe. It quickly became the most authoritative and popular book in Europe, only second to the Bible. Amongst the most damning ideas advocated by this book, 3 things stand out. 1. If you didn't believe in witches, you were either a heretic or a witch yourself. 2. All forms of magic, good or evil, stem from making a pact with the devil or his demons. And 3. Since, obviously, women are more weak-willed than men, they are the devil's easiest target to make a pact with. According to the author of this book, Heinrich Kramer, this is because of women's well-established wickedness, their credulousness and propensity to influence, their slippery tongues, their underdeveloped intellect, and their many carnal abominations. The book then goes on to describe in detail how these women take part in orgies on the dark Sabbath, where they renew their pact with Satan by Now, the ordinary peasant couldn't read Malleus Maleficarum, yet they too would mainly point the finger and accuse women of witchcraft. So how could that be? Women were responsible for domestic duties like childcare and food preparation. Women were associated with traditional healing arts and consulted when illness or injury struck. Women were midwives, often called for in times of trouble. Let's say that something went wrong after someone consulted these women. When looking for someone to blame, misfortune could quickly turn to spite, and fingers could easily be turned towards these women when looking for someone to blame. Women who were more argumentative and outspoken about their opinions, or women who were more overtly sexual than their neighbors, aroused feelings of jealousy and insecurity. In short, women who didn't fit into the strict standards of society, such as single mothers, widows, the infirm or mentally ill, were the typical victims of these witch hunts. 80% of those accused of witchcraft were women. People often saw witchcraft as a sort of sexually transmitted disease, so many men were also accused of witchcraft simply for associating with or supporting these women. Although I must point out that in some regions, such as Normandy, Estonia, Iceland or Moscow, men were far more likely to be accused of witchcraft than women. It could be that witch hunts in these regions were instigated by political or philosophical heresies, in which case it would be mostly men who would be accused and killed. Amidst this fear and paranoia, there were still skeptics who spoke out against witch hunts. Despite all the risks it entailed, in 1584, Reginald Scot, a member of the English Parliament, wrote and published a 600-page manuscript called The Discovery of Witchcraft. In his book, he pointed out the absurdity of witchcraft and provided a natural explanation for what people claimed to be the result of evil magic. He also points out the flawed and corrupt nature of the investigations carried out by the witch hunters. He explains how people who believed that they were witches themselves could perhaps be suffering from mental distress. In his book, he illustrates how conmen and entertainers could pretend to do seemingly magical tricks by sleight of hand, and he gave detailed descriptions of their tricks and the various gadgets that they would use. Regrettably, his efforts were fruitless, and his book never reached the same level of popularity as his counterparts. For most readers, the straightforward narrative offered by the witch hunters and demonologists about a cabal of sexual deviants who made a pact with the devil and were to blame for all the misfortune that befell society was far more attractive than Reginald's sobering dose of skepticism. Eventually, 13 years later, the paranoid King of England and Scotland, James I, an avid believer in witchcraft, wrote and published a book on witchcraft himself. Then he proceeded to burn every copy of Reginald's book that he could get his hands on. So far, we have looked at some of the main elements that set the stage for the witch hunt. They explain why it took the particular shape that it did. But now, it's time to take a closer look and find the component that cascaded everything. In the Middle Ages, if you accused someone of a crime, you had to collect all the evidence and gather all the witnesses yourself. And if you couldn't prove that the person you accused was guilty, then it was you who the jury would punish. Since it was really tough to provide evidence for most crimes at the time, people resolved a lot of trials either by battle or by ordeal. For example, a popular ordeal was ordeal by fire. In one type of ordeal by fire, the defendant had to walk 5 steps forward while carrying a burning iron rod. After a period of time, if their hand healed quickly and didn't blister, they were deemed innocent. If not, they were judged to be guilty. But things started to change in the early modern period. States were expanding their powers, and so they established inquisitorial procedures. When previously the accuser had to find and present the evidence in court himself, now the state tasked a professional inquisitor with the investigation. And with certain crimes, there was also now an opportunity to accuse someone in secret without having to reveal your own identity. The new system incentivized accusations, confessions, and implicating others. Of course, a lot of people use this confusion and paranoia for their own benefit. For example, there is the account of Edmund Robinson, a boy who had accused a woman of kidnapping him to a witch's sabbath, where some 60 participants were producing meat, butter, and milk by pulling on some ropes. He named several witches, and 17 of them got convicted. But when a skeptical judge interrogated the boy confessed and said that it was actually his father who had fabricated the whole story and gave him a list of names out of envy, revenge, and hope of gain. In an attempt by the state to solidify their power and authority, local courts and magistrates reacted to popular pressure with witch trials. But since witchcraft is an invisible crime, again, most trials had to be resolved by ordeal. The famous one of which was an ordeal by water. In this trial, after they bound the accused, they would plunge them into the water. If they were to sink somewhat deeply into the water, then they would be deemed innocent and pulled out. But if she were to stay afloat on the water, then she would fail the trial and she would be found guilty. To not rely on these trials by ordeal, the inquisitors used torture to draw out confessions instead. However, they weren't entirely clueless about the unreliability of torture for establishing the truth. People were fully aware that torture could lead to an unwarranted conviction. This is why most European kingdoms had actually prohibited torturing criminals for confessions in the Middle Ages. So these early modern European courts devised a set of rules when using torture to avoid misleading confessions. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. First of all, they said that pregnant women and children were altogether exempt from torture. They also thought that torturing the accused should not result in permanent injury, and that a person should not be tortured repeatedly. And finally, confessions made in the torture chamber could not actually be counted as evidence in the court until a period of 2 to 3 days had passed, when the accused would make the same confessions again in open court. According to a judge in a witch trial, with all the tools and devices available to them, the torture of forced sleeplessness was actually the most effective kind of torture. He claimed that fewer than 2% of all the victims could endure this torture without confessing. However civil and well-intentioned these restrictions on torture might seem, the fact remains that many judges and inquisitors didn't actually stick to these guidelines whatsoever. For example, in a German town in 1631, they repeatedly tortured a woman 56 times. The hangman told her, "I do not take you for 1, 2, 3, not for 8 days, not for a few weeks, but half a year or a year, for your whole life until you confess. And if you do not confess, I shall torture you to death, and you shall be burnt after all." What is even more terrifying about this first-hand account is that the victim herself was pregnant, and she should not have been tortured in the first place, according to the law. When someone started a witch panic, sometimes it would spread like wildfire and spiral out of control. Usually, these trials would end when people began to accuse members of the ruling class. For example, the witch trials of Würzburg in 1629, which claimed 219 lives, ended when the Prince Bishop of Würzburg was implicated himself. In the end, within this transitional period between the medieval to modern court, it is estimated that 40 to 60,000 innocent people were accused of witchcraft and killed. Today, in the developed world, the occult science and folk practices of healing and magic are incorporated into pseudo-psychology, self-help literature, and New Age spirituality, which many enjoy without any stigma. But the story in some developing countries is entirely different. Far from fading away, witch hunting has actually become a growing global problem. In fact, in the 20th century alone, more people were accused of witchcraft and brutally murdered than during the 3 centuries of the witch craze that gripped early modern Europe. Between 1960 and the year 2000, about 40,000 people were murdered in Tanzania alone. And according to the Indian police records, more than 2,500 people have been killed for alleged sorcery just in the last 2 decades. According to data from 2019, about 200 witch killings are estimated to occur each year in Papua New Guinea. These innocent women are trialed publicly before being roasted alive over open flames, crucified, dragged behind vehicles, strung up and beaten to death, stoned to death, beheaded, forced to drink gasoline, or buried alive. You might not be able to see it in your everyday life, But the crucible is still burning, and the nightmare continues. Hey there, thank you so much for sticking around till the end of this video. It took me a solid 6 months to put this together, and I did my best to be as factual as I can, but I'm not a professional historian with a PhD. So if you think I might have slipped up somewhere, which I'm sure I have, please do feel free to let me know in the comment section. My main goal was to spark curiosity, and I hope this video serves as a jumping off point for people to dive deeper. If you did enjoy this video then, please do subscribe, because I'm working on a lot more videos just like this one, and I can't wait for you to see what's coming up. Okay, thanks again. Bye!